Hi guys, welcome back to another true crime video here today on Addie's World. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome back if you've been here before, and if not, hello. My name's Aodain. Yeah, I've been meaning to do this video for the last about 6 days, but I've been sick. Not corona, I finally got the energy. Here we are. This case that I'm doing today is like batshit crazy. I'm putting a viewer's discretion on it purely because this deals with sexual assault, strangulation, drowning, necrophilia and interfering with corpses. So I am going to put that disclaimer right there now, purely because it needs it. It's a very intense case and there's a lot of details in it. So the second thing I'm going to do is actually split this into 2 different videos, purely because there's a lot of information in it. The person I'm going to be talking about actually had 12 victims, and I just feel I don't want to rush off the victims and not give them their justice or respect. So I am going to talk about each individual victim. I just don't want to rush through it and disrespect any of them, and I want to give them the justice that they deserve. So who I am going to be talking about is Dennis Andrew Nilsen. He was a prolific Scottish killer between 1978 and 1983. Well, yeah, I'm going to let you make up your own mind. Have you heard of the case? Do you know anything about it? So before we jump into this crazy story, welcome back if you've been here before. If not, hi, lovely to meet you. As I said, my name's Aodain and I'm from Ireland. I'm very new to YouTube, and what I'm doing or trying to do at the moment is a bit of true crime with a bit of beauty and everything in between. What that means is true crime is obviously cases talking about things I find interesting, like what the inner mind of a psychopath, a serial killer, a sociopath. With the beauty side of things and everything in between, I'm not very good at makeup at all, but I am trying to get better. So I'm watching tutorials myself and I'm trying out new products. I do have one that I tried, an Irish company, and I'll link that up here for you if you want to check it out and see how bad I am. But I also do stuff like unboxing. I bought quite an expensive beauty box from Etsy and I'm still waiting for that to come, but I can't wait for it to come. I'll do an unboxing and a try on with you guys next week. Please don't laugh. I've bought wigs and I have joined up to a makeup course to learn how to do Halloween makeup online. So I'm going to try to do a bit of Halloween makeup with my true crime stories, and the true crime are going to be horror next week. So if you have any suggestions, put them down below. If that sounds like something you're interested in, true crime, bit of beauty, bit of everything in between, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and make sure the bell is turned on so you'll be notified of all the videos that are coming up. Alright, let's jump in. Okay, as mentioned at the start of this video, we're going to talk about Dennis Nilsen. He was one of the most prolific Scottish serial killers. So Dennis was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh in Aberdeen in Scotland, which is actually in Aberdeen in Scotland. Very interested in this case because I actually went to college in Scotland, in Aberdeen. Olaf was a Norwegian soldier. His mum was kind of a very strict Catholic. He is the second child of 3. He does have an older brother named Olaf and a younger sister named Sylvia. Olaf Sr. was said to have been an alcoholic. He didn't have much of a relationship with any of his family. He abandoned the family altogether. But his mother actually ended up marrying another man named Andrew Scott. He was also very strict Catholic, and Dennis didn't get on with him to begin with, but he said begrudgingly throughout the years he did come to respect him. Dennis was kind of the awkward one of the family. He didn't really participate in much, but he was very close to his maternal grandfather, whose name was Andrew as well, actually. They were so close. Let's just say it how it is. He was a bit of an oddball. Dennis had great respect for his grandfather and actually had a great relationship with his grandfather, who was actually Andrew White. They would always said to go on long walks. Andrew himself was a fisherman, and when he went out to sea, Dennis would have always said, life would be empty for me until he returned. He was a great hero and protector. So you can see kind of starting from the get-go that shitty father figure in his actual biological father. His grandfather steps in, he idolizes the man, but in 1951 the worst happens. When Andrew was actually out at sea, he passes away. Being the kind of very strict Catholic family that they are, they have an open coffin, and his mother, Betty, asks Dennis does he want to look at the body, which he does. In my head it's just like, he's like, oh yeah, He just looked so peaceful sleeping there. And to me, this is kind of a red flag from the get-go, because you'll see why, but it's just, he just thought he looked like he was asleep, and he's gone to a better place and he just looked so peaceful. He withdrew from the family really completely, and he was jealous of his older brother because everything kind of came naturally to his older brother. He was outgoing, he was fun, he related to people, while Dennis didn't. And he didn't have that kind of foothold in the family with his grandfather anymore. So then puberty hit, and Dennis realised he could be gay or bisexual. He wasn't 100% sure. He was living in a rural place with very Catholic parents. It wasn't going to be accepted. He didn't tell anyone. He couldn't explore it. This was the 1950s as well. It wasn't accepted, and he didn't know himself because he was ashamed and he was confused. I'm just going to hold up my red pen when I need a red flag, guys, so ding ding. He was confused. He didn't know if he was bisexual because he found the boys and the men he was attracted to were slight, almost feminine looking, and he thought boys that looked like his sister were attractive. He was, again, even further confused. He wasn't sure if he was attracted to his sister or was that he cared and he loved her so much that that's what he was confusing it with. Ding ding ding. There was an incident where he actually did fondle his older brother in his sleep, and the older brother found out and he realised what he had done. So he suspected that Dennis was gay himself, and he actually ended up torturing him, belittling him every chance he got in public. Like, he'd do it in public, he'll do it in front of family members, in front of friends and stuff like that. So it really made Dennis feel about yay big. So, and in years to come, years later, there is an actual story. Dennis's brother and his wife, so Olaf and his wife, family friend and his wife, and Dennis were all having dinner one night, and they ended up watching a film which had homosexual themes through the film. An actual fight broke out in the end where Dennis was defending gay rights and the disrespect that they received and how hard they had it, that his brother realised definitely he was gay and blurted out in front of family members and in front of his mum. So it was said from that time on, Dennis had no contact with his older brother and very little contact with his whole family after that. It was a tough time. An excuse what he becomes. It must have been difficult around that time that he had no male figure to talk to about. I mean, his father was a drunk and he fecked off. His grandfather had passed away, and the new man in his mum's life was very strict Catholic as well. So it wouldn't have been accepted. And the fact that he was probably socially awkward and a bit reclusive, he didn't seem to have any friends that would have been able to guide him in the right direction either. So it's all kind of building up to a hot fucking mess at this stage. So, and he ended up joining the army and he wanted to train as a chef. So, you know, he felt like by getting out of the small town he could maybe live his own life and he could probably figure out what was actually going on. In 1961, he began his training at the Army Catering Corps in Alderscott, and he was said to have excelled at his duties. Therefore, in 1964, he was actually stationed in West Germany. And around this time, Dennis himself began to drink heavily, and a few people that were with him at the time were said he was unreal shy, and you could see that he was drinking to cure his shyness, and he was blacking out drunk. He was just drinking a lot. And remember I said about those red flags, people? There was one night Dennis and another German youth actually got so drunk they just passed out. And the next morning Dennis seemed to have woken up before this man, and he looked at him and he said it kind of sparked a sexual fantasy in Dennis at the time, when he was saying he'd love to have a partner who would either be sexually submissive or unconscious or even dead. It just put a thought in his head and it just sparked these sexual fantasies. Again, Dennis couldn't be himself. He felt like he couldn't say anything about his sexual orientation. Like, he was even afraid to shower with the other cadets due to he didn't want to get an erection. He had a fear of getting an erection and being found out. So he preferred to bathe by himself, where he could do manly activities by himself, you know. So the sexual fantasies were kind of planted in his head, and he even began to drink more or pretend to black out on nights out, so in hopes of whoever was bringing him home would actually sexually assault him or rope him or anything like that. He began to live a very dangerous life with alcohol. So then in 1967 he was stationed in the state of Aodain, the state of Aodain, and he was at the Al Mansoura prison. Now this apparently was one of the more dangerous territories, and the third traumatic event happened to Dennis around this time. Is he was actually kidnapped. He was in a taxi and he was kidnapped by the taxi driver. He was bound, gagged, and he was put into a boot of a car. Now eventually it turned out he did escape, but again, those sexual fantasies of someone being totally submissive, unconscious, helpless. Although it was traumatic at the time, again, at the back of his mind, it was like, it just kind of stirred and kind of fueled the fire of those fantasies. He actually had his own room where he could masturbate by himself and not in fear of not being caught, but also he had a full-length mirror. This is where it gets. What he would do is stand in the mirror, and he'd actually, top of the mirror, he would stand so close that it would actually take the top of his head so he could just see the thin, kind of frail body. And therefore he could imagine touching somebody unconscious or somebody who was submissive. Yeah, he did what he did and he had fun thinking that way. Let's just leave it at that. Now, this is just an unfortunate date. 1969. Yes. He had his first sexual experience with a woman. And of course he went back to the lads and he was like, oh yeah, bragging about everything. But reality, he just said it was overrated and depressing. Then in 1972 he finally finished his military career and he left a position of corporal. He went home for a few months then, and his mom was at him that he had no female company, and this time that he had the big fight with his brother, and his brother told everyone, and he decided he was going to go to London to join the Metropolitan Police. He went down and he trained, and he was a junior constable for the time he was there. But his one regret was that he never got to subdue anyone. He was kind of having casual flings and back to heavy drinking and isolating himself. And he did have sexual encounters, he did hook up, he went to more gay bars and tried to put himself out there. But what he said around this time, it was soul-destroying liaisons in which he would lend his partner his body in a vain attempt for peace. He was becoming disillusioned with being in the police in 1973. Biological father Olaf Sr. passed away and he left each of his 3 children £1,000 each. He was getting delusioned with being in the Metropolitan Police, so he decided he would quit. Around this time he was drinking a lot, he was isolating a lot, but he ended up meeting David Glackian around 1975. He met David outside a pub, and from talking he realised that David was unemployed. He also was gay, living in a hostel. And they decided to go back to Dennis's room that he was renting, 80 tea mountains. David stayed the night, they drank and they talked all night. And the next morning they actually decided they should live together. Dennis used some of the money that he'd got from his father and they decided to move into the apartment 196 in Melrose Avenue. Dennis was said to have negotiated with the landlord at the time that they had exclusive access to the garden. Just remember. So this was a bottom floor flat. They moved in 1975. By around 1977, the novelty had wore off. They were fighting, they weren't even sleeping in the same bed anymore. They were even bringing home kind of casual sexual partners for themselves. And eventually in 1978, David moved out. Anyway, he was gone by 1978. And again, Dennis fell into this kind of solitary, lonely life of drinking, working, drinking and working. Now his job was actually a good job and he was doing quite well in it, but it was the evenings that just became really lonely and he found himself drinking a whole lot more. This is 1978. We're coming up to his very first victim. And I'm just going to put in the little warning here as well, guys, because this does deal with necrophilia, strangulation, sexual assault, dismemberment, dissection. I will talk a bit about each victim. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was known as the Munson Hill murderer or the kindly killer due to the location of where the bodies were found or the friendly face in which he encountered his victims and offered assistance, and that was his ploy to lure people back to his house. These stories are really tough because his MO was basically luring in people who were gay, who were homeless, who were fighting addiction, preyed and lured these people back to his flat with the promise of warm meal, shelter, and just totally preyed on people like that. He kind of offered them what they needed so they in reality couldn't say no. He knew exactly what he was doing and how to go about it. I feel. So unfortunately his first victim was a 14-year-old. That's why I have to break this story into two, because it doesn't get any better. So he was a 14-year-old named Stephen Holmes, and it happened around the 30th of December 1978. Stephen was obviously underage and he was in one of the bars and he was trying to get served alcohol. He's been told to jog on, and Dennis saw this and he offered, said, come back to my flat, I've got plenty of drink, you can have what you want. Well, they were drinking all night and Stephen actually fell asleep and no sexual activity happened at that time. But the next morning, or those next morning, when Dennis wakes up and he looked over at Stephen, he said, God, I'm so lonely. I want him to spend New Year's with me even if he doesn't want to. So he proceeded to straddle Stephen on the chest and strangled him till he was unconscious. And from there, when he was unconscious, he then drowned him in a bucket of water. So not only did he strangle Stephen, he also drowned him. And then he had a sick ritual of he would place the person in the bath and he would wash them and bathe them. And then after that, he would dress them in a pair of men's boxers and socks. Dennis did admit to masturbating over Stephen's body twice before placing him in floorboards. He said sporadically sometimes he would have taken the victims out. He actually kept Stephen's body in the flat under the floorboards for 8 months before his chosen method of disposal, which I'll go into. After Stephen and before his next actual victim, he did attempt to murder a man from Hong Kong by the name of Andrew Ho. Andrew did escape. He did report the incident but didn't press any charges. Next victim, 23-year-old Canadian tourist, and his name was Kenneth Ockenstein. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. It was the 3rd of December 1979. Dennis actually offered to show him the site and be his tour guide. Again, the same MO. He strangled him with the cord of his own headphones and drowned him and dressed him. The difference this time is he actually kept the body out, and the next day he went and he bought a Polaroid camera, and from there he then proceeded to place the body in different positions, be it sexual, and took and kept the photos. Another twisted thing he ended up doing was spreading the body out over himself and lying on his bed to watch TV like they were a couple. So he was basically lying back and he put the body on top of him and continued to watch TV. Like, and again put his body under the floorboards. He actually had admitted to taking the body out 4 times before he was disposed of, and would sit him up, lay him on him to watch TV, or he would sit him in a chair like he had company. When I say these don't get any easier or any better, I really mean it, because the next victim was a 16-year-old catering student from Birkenhead, and his name was Martin Duffy, and he had hitched a ride into London without his parents knowing. He was there for 4 days and he ended up being homeless for 4 days. Then Dennis comes along and offers him what he was craving: food, shelter. He managed to get him back to his flat. He did say though about Martin, he was the youngest I'd ever seen, which to me is the sickest comment to make. Oh God, it just sends shivers down your spine. And because he was so young and so innocent looking, that after he'd done the bath and redressed him in just the socks and the boxers, he then continued for about 2 to 3 hours to caress and kiss and fondle the body. He also decided he would compliment the body. He was said to have stored this body in the cupboard, but after a few days he noticed the body was starting to bloat, and he said, so callously, he said, under the floorboards he went. This was obviously the killing of his 3rd victim. So after this, Dennis became much more fluid, therefore the frequency increased exponentially. He wasn't caught, there was no suspicion. He was getting men who were not as noticeable. The killing of Martin took place in May of 1980, and by the end of 1980 he had managed to kill another 5 men and attack another 1. It gets a bit hazy around here because Dennis himself claims he can't remember the victims' names, or he can't remember how the victims were killed. But the next victim is Billy Sutherland, and he was a Scottish sex worker and he was 18 years of age. And Nilsen couldn't remember how he killed him, but by finding the bones they could actually see that Billy himself was manual strangulation. In the summer then of 1980, the bodies were starting to smell, and when he lifted up the floorboards he could see maggots, things dissolving and everything. So he decided he would light a bonfire in his back garden to burn the bodies. And again, to me, he was so clever that he could think this far ahead, that he knew the bodies, if he burnt, there'd be flesh, of hair, of organs, everything. So cleverly he decided he would throw a car tire on top of the bonfire, so when anyone could smell, they could smell the burnt rubber, and that's what people would put down to the odd smell. Looks like that back garden came in use for something. That's why I don't believe when he said, I didn't intend to kill them until I was just about to do it. Why did he plan and why did he negotiate so hard for the access to the back garden? Dennis eventually went out. He would go with his rake and make sure all kind of bones and particles were smashed or burnt, and at one stage he did come across a full skull that he ended up just hitting with his rake and breaking it up even further and just raking it away. Over the course of the time he's in Melrose Avenue, he did have 3 bonfires, get rid of and destroy any evidence. In 1981 there was said to have been 3 victims, again that Nilsen cannot remember, and he only remembers them by nickname. He doesn't remember how he killed them. He doesn't remember one was Belfast Boy, the English Skinhead, and the Blue-Eyed Scot. Now the Blue-Eyed Scot could have been Billy Sutherland. I just find that so hard. He doesn't even know their real names. And so horrible and so callous. This is another thing I find so hard about this case. He becomes so used to killing and so callous and not affected by this that one of his quotes was, "End of the day, end of the drink, end of a person. Floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work in Denmark Street." That's all he saw. He didn't see the person anymore. Oh God, it just, the mind of a serial killer, and just what, I know he had tough times, but what snapped in someone? Or what went wrong in that person that this is how he thought of other people's lives? Oh, it just makes me so angry. Angry! The next case is also such a horrible case. It was a 23-year-old named Malcolm. I don't know how to say Malcolm's second name, but I will pop it up on the screen. Because Nilsen found Malcolm outside his actual flat. He thought he had collapsed. Nilsen thought he was drunk or he was high. But it turned out that Malcolm actually had epilepsy and he was on medication for it, which caused weakness in his limbs. He actually brought him up to the flat and then phoned the ambulance for him, and he went to hospital. But the next day he was discharged. He decided to go back and he would thank Dennis and have a few drinks and have something to eat. Again, Malcolm was found to be manual strangled. His body was stored cupboard until he was burned. In 1981, the landlord of Melrose Avenue decided he wanted to renovate. Nilsen was very against this and wasn't going to move out. The landlord ended up paying him £1,000 and eventually he agreed to it. Before he left, he had one last bonfire. So Nilsen had to get out of his ground floor flat with his garden, and this to me is the turning point in this case. It may have gone on for another few years, but this was the start of the downfall of this so intelligent but so stupid man. An evil, twisted, stupid man. His new flat was 23 Crawley Garden, and this was an attic flat. So he didn't have any floorboards he could store anything or anyone under. He didn't have access to a garden. So therefore anyone who had came to visit or anyone he invited back to his flat for the first 2 months of living in this new apartment, nobody came to any harm. He couldn't do anything, and he didn't do anything for 2 months. Unfortunately, the urge still came to him. So on the 23rd of November 1981, a 19-year-old Paul Nobbs came back to the flat. Again, tried with drink, food, anything he could. Dennis proceeded to strangle him. Again, because Paul had passed out for some unknown reason, Nilsen let him go. And he didn't realise anything had happened until a few days later, till he actually went to his own GP with pains in his neck. And when the doctor examined him, he said, that's signs of strangulation. You need to go to the police about this. And again, Paul in this time feared sexual orientation. He didn't want to get abused. He didn't know if he'd be taken serious, so it never was brought to the police, purely because he was afraid of how he would have been treated. And I think that's the sad thing. And you see the people he attacked and the court case of this, they were so afraid of how they would have been taken and how they knew they wouldn't be taken seriously or as second-class citizens or not given the respect that they felt like they couldn't make a report and file charges. So in March 1982, there was a 23-year-old named John Howlett, and he unfortunately was the first person to be killed in this new apartment in Crawley Garden. John himself fought, and actually when he was being strangled, it turned out that he ended up turning the tables on Nilsen and ended up strangling him too. But eventually Nilsen overpowered him and he ended up strangling him with a leather upholstery belt. Again, he ended up drowning him, and just, it did put a bit of a fear in Nilsen that actually people could fight back on his first victim that was killed at this new apartment. Then we move on to a 21-year-old Carl Stotter, and this occurred in May 1982. And again, you could just show how Dennis preyed on the vulnerable and the weak. Carl was just after breaking up with his partner and he was very depressed, very down in the dump. Nilsen took advantage of him and brought him back. Carl was slightly different. Carl had fell asleep on a sleeping bag. Dennis strangling him, saying don't move. And then he could remember also water and him being drowned. And after all this, it turns out that Carl actually didn't die, and he woke up to Dennis's dog actually lick him in the face. And when he came to the next day, Nilsen claimed that he had managed to get himself caught up in the sleeping bag, and Nilsen was trying to save him. And when he said about the drowning, he was like, "You went unconscious and I was trying to wake you up." He was mentally prepared with every answer he could, and eventually actually ended up letting Carol go. In 1982, a 27-year-old named Graham Allen unfortunately became the second victim of the Cranley Gardens flat. This one is especially hard because this man was homeless, and Dennis brought him back to his flat, and the man was hungry, and while he was eating, he strangled him and then drowned him. And for 3 days, he didn't know what to do with him, because he had nowhere to store him. What he actually ended up doing is dismembering and dissecting his body 3 days later on the kitchen floor, placing body parts in plastic bags and storing them in different parts of his house. The last victim is especially hard. His name was Stephen Sinclair. He was only 20 years of age. On the 26th of January 1983, Nilsen invited him back to the flat, and as he was strangling him, he noticed that Stephen had 2 bandages on his wrist, and he had actually tried to commit suicide himself a few days before. Didn't stop Nilsen, and just before he killed him, he said, "Oh Stephen, here I go again." And this is what Dennis said he said to the victim in his statements. After killing Stephen and washed the body, he ended up lying on the bed with Stephen for hours, just laying beside him and looking at him. I can't find that anything sexual was done to Stephen, but before he dismembered him, he just kissed him on the head and said, "Good night, Stephen." And to me, that's just horrendous and hard to hear, and just that poor man was suffering. They all were suffering. He just, as I said, preyed on the people who were weak and vulnerable. He did it time and time and time again. It's just heartbreaking. Just heartbreaking. I'll end on this. To get rid of the bodies in the Cranley Garden, anything he could boil, he would boil to remove any flesh, any internal organs, anything like that. He would boil them and remove the skin. And he would flush small bones and the flesh down the toilet. And then other parts of the body he would store in plastic bags around his flat. And twice his neighbours had complained to the landlord, and twice the landlord came up to him and said there was a smell. And he claimed that his freezer had broken and the meat had all spoiled, and he was trying to get it fixed. Around the 4th of February 1983, this is why I think he's so clever in one way, then so stupid in other ways. The whole apartment complex were having problems with the plumbing. I wonder why. And he himself took it upon him to write a letter to the estate agent and to make a complaint about the plumbing, and how him and the other people, how the situation was intolerable. So he sent the letter. That brings the next part of the story, but at the moment that's a lot to digest, guys, so I'm actually going to leave it here, and I will be putting up the next part tomorrow. I swear I will. Thank you so much for tuning in. Mwah, mwah, mwah. I hope you find this case as interesting as I do, and I hope I'm doing justice to the victims and to the story. But thank you so much for being here. Love to you all. Have a good day. Be good, be kind, and be safe. Enjoy. Bye.